Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad to see all of you here. It's really going to be a special evening, that I can promise you. I would like to first of all thank Jay Wegman and all of the people here at the Skirball Center who have helped us put this program together. As Executive Director of the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, I want to extend a greeting from its president, Tony Marks, who has described Ben Barber, whom we honor tonight, as a man before his time, a visionary. And I'd also like to recognize Ben's wife, Leah Barber, and their daughter, Nellie, and any of the members of the family are here. Leah and Nellie, would you stand for a moment for me? Thank you. I'd like to recognize the partners who have worked for the last year and a half to make this program possible. Rachel Cooper, Global Programmer for the Asia Society, Michael Denisa, Tom McIntyre from the Bradamus Center, Alberta Arthurs, and Joan Firestone, who are great cultural leaders. Can you thank them, please? To all of you, I want to say how grateful I have been for your help with these programs that we're going to see tonight and hear tonight. Next, I'd like to thank our sponsors who have generously supported this event. Jody and John Arnhold, the Ford Foundation, Agnes Gunn, Dr. David Melcher Foundation, the Jerome Robbins Foundation, and Sarah Billinghurst Solomon. As you know, none of this could happen without that kind of help. So can you say thank you to them? So now I'm going to take you back to 2003, when political theorist Benjamin Barber, who passed away in 2017, he became very concerned, like many of us, about the lack of communication and respect across cultures. He understood that we were inherently connected and in fact live in an interdependent world. We could not live in isolation if we are to survive. Our work was across all sectors and nations. So he began gathering world leaders in Philadelphia in partnership with the mayor in 2003 for a couple of days of forums to discuss the concept of global interdependence. Subsequently, forums were held around the world to talk about how to engender inclusiveness in the world that appears to be becoming more and more exclusive, where people of different cultures are increasingly marginalized. Tonight's forum gives us an opportunity to look at those who believe in global interdependence and who are doing something extraordinary about creating change. It is our hope that we all find ways to become agents of change so that we can see a future that is respectful and inclusive of what some people describe as other. To start us off, it's my great pleasure to welcome Oscar Eustis, artistic producer of the Public Theater, to share with us his thoughts about this very important topic. Oscar is the perfect example of an agent of change through culture. Oscar, we're so grateful to you for taking time to speak to us this evening. So friends and colleagues, Oscar Eustis, thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me here, and thank you, Jackie, for that overly lavish introduction, I have to say. Agent of change, maybe. Try to be. It's always hard when you're talking to try and get the balance right between specificity and broadness, to try and not simply blow hot air, but talk about things you actually know about, and yet at the same time to try and extrapolate from those things you know about and have experienced to try to make something that's useful to other people. That's what I'm going to try and do in the next 15, 20 minutes. And you'll tell me if, you'll tell each other if I've succeeded. You won't actually tell me. The reason that I do theater, and the reason that I believe in theater as an agent for change, is that the theater and democracy were invented in the same decade, in the same city, in Athens in the 6th century BC. In the same decade, the idea of democracy was created, and by democracy it was obviously a flawed democracy. Women had absolutely no authority, a right to vote, a franchise. It was a slave society. There are many, many things wrong with that when we look at Athenian democracy. but the idea that power flowed from the consent of the governed, that power flowed from below to above, not from above to below, was pioneered in that city. And in that same decade, somebody, legend has it, their name was Thespis, invented the idea of dialogue. The Dionysian festival, we don't, all of this, by the way, I'm making up. In other words, we have some evidence about it, but what I'm doing is I'm taking the little bit of evidence we have and I'm making a story out of it, which is what I do for a living. So as part of this story, what happened is we know at the Festival of Dionysius, people spoke. They danced, they had religious rituals, and there was storytelling. And the entire city of Athens would gather and sit on the side of the Acropolis and listen to these stories. And then right at the time that they were contemplating the idea that power should flow from below to above, Thespis decided that instead of talking to you, somebody should just turn 90 degrees to the left and talk to somebody else on stage, and invented the idea of dialogue. And in that invention, something fundamental changed about the relationship to the audience that I believe is an exact analogy for democracy. Because there's really two things I want to point out here. The first is that we changed from here, me being the voice of authority, talking to you, passively leaning back in your chairs. You may disagree with me, but you're going to be polite and quiet about it because I have the truth and I'm talking to you, to two people talking together. And because it's drama, right, they're disagreeing with each other. There's conflict. And in that moment, you're actually making a statement about the nature of truth. You're saying that truth is not the possession of anybody. Truth is what occurs in the conflict between different points of view. And if you don't believe that, you don't believe in democracy. You're just putting up with democracy so you can get your way. If you believe in democracy, you believe that that's how truth emerges. And the theater becomes the artistic tool for expressing it. The other thing that the theater is asking you to do is, instead of just listening to me, I'm asking you to identify with this person talking, and then to identify with the other person disagreeing with the first person. I'm asking you to practice empathy. Practice putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so whether democracy created the theater or whether the theater allowed democracy to happen, I do believe that the theater is the fundamental art form of democracy. And I'm going to give you now, that was close to hot air, so now let me give you some things that I actually know about. We revived a few years ago. I'm lucky enough to sit in the chair that Joe Papp founded. And at the Public Theater a few years ago, we revived the mobile unit to take Shakespeare out to people who normally don't get access to the culture. And we did it because the immense success of Free Shakespeare in the Park had created a problem. Free Shakespeare in the Park has been going for over 60 years. It's a brilliant success. But we removed the economic barriers, and Shakespeare in the Park has become one of the hardest tickets to get in New York City. Because who can wait in line for 8 to 10 hours to get a ticket to a Shakespeare play? You've eliminated 99% of your potential audience before you even started. So as a price of that success, we had to revive the mobile unit, going back to places where people who have the least access to our culture get to have access. First year we went out. We took Shakespeare's Measure for Measure to the women's prison that at that point was on the west side of Manhattan. And in Measure to Measure, I will remind you, there is a point where Isabel comes to plead for her brother's life to Antonio the Duke. And she pleads because her brother has been convicted of lechery because he has impregnated his fiancée, and there he's been condemned to death. She pleads and pleads, and in response, the Duke says, yes, I will free your brother if you will give yourself to me. He has developed an insane passion for Isabel. And she says, I'm not going to do that. And he says, then your brother will die tomorrow. And he leaves the stage. So at the women's prison, Nicole Watson, the brilliant actress who was playing Isabel, was left alone. And she turned to the audience and she said the first line of Shakespeare's soliloquy, "To whom should I complain?" And a voice immediately ran back, "The police!" This was early in the tour. She was a little startled. But then you could see this immense serenity come over her face because she just looked at the woman in the audience and she said the next line that Shakespeare wrote for her, "If I did report this, who would believe me? And the woman said, no one, girl. So on the one hand, the Shakespeare geek in me is completely freaking out. They were written as call and response. Oh my God, that Shakespeare knew what he was doing. But on the other hand, what that was simply a very dramatic demonstration of something that we found throughout our time with the mobile unit. People need stories. People need art. They need it as bad as they need food and drink and shelter. And when you go into places where people have been deprived of that, you feel it. And you feel it so powerfully that most of the staff of the public, when they come out of the mobile tours, they say, why are we doing anything else? So we've established, actually, that there's a need for this stuff. And then I'm going to tell you another story, sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is in January of 2017, Vice President-elect Pence chose to come to Hamilton, uptown. Some of you may remember this. We only found out about it about 2 in the afternoon. And we then composed an extremely polite statement that Brandon Victor Dixon read from the stage. And I have to say, I have no objections to what Mike Pence did. He listened in the lobby to the statement and then left. When he was booed upon arriving at the theater, he turned to his son and said, son, that's the sound of democracy. So great. His boss was not quite so sanguine and sent out a series of angry tweets, which led to an online boycott of Hamilton. And within a couple of days, a couple 100,000 people had signed up for the boycott. And I looked at these numbers, and I went, something's wrong with this picture. These people would never come into Hamilton anyway. It wasn't coming to a city near them. If it did, they couldn't afford a ticket. And if they could afford a ticket, they didn't have the connections to get one. And that was when I realized, oh, actually, we've been boycotting them a long time before they've been boycotting us. And then I took a look at the red and blue electoral map of the United States. Do this as an exercise, not the state by state, but the county by county. And if you had given me that county by county map and said to me, Oscar, all of the blue is where nonprofit theaters are in the country, and the red is where there's no nonprofit theater, it would be uncannily accurate. The theater, and by that I hope I can be referring to more than just the theater, but the arts, has done the same thing that the economy, the technology, and politics have done to half this country, which is turn our back on them and ignore them and say, you are not for us, and we have nothing for you. And I'm happy to say that we've begun a process. Last fall, we sent out a tour of Lynn Nottage's brilliant play, Sweat, and we toured rural Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota. And it was what we found, as you might expect, but I wasn't sure, was an enormous appetite, incredible appreciation. The deepest discussions we've ever had with an audience were in those places. And again, we know there's a need, but we have to go where people are. We can't demand they come to us. If we're going to serve, we need to serve the people where they are, whether it's in prison or in Erie, Pennsylvania. And the third story I want to tell you relatively quickly is the story of our Public Works program. And the Public Works program was inspired by the pageant movement, which really took root and flourished in the United States in the late years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. Pageants began in the 1870s and 1880s as kind of town celebrations where towns would mobilize all their citizenry to put on the story of their town. But the movement, which was completely an amateur movement, swept the country until by 1910, the National Convention of State Pageant Associations had their meeting in Madison Square Garden and filled it up. Every state in the Union had pageants, and the pageants had begun to expand. John Reed of 10 Days That Shook the World fame staged a pageant about the Paterson Strike using the Paterson workers, with hundreds and hundreds of workers functioning as actors. The suffragists put on a pageant on the steps of the Treasury Department in Washington, demanding the vote. It was this astonishing national movement of amateur art and theater making that was essentially swept out of existence by the First World War, the Palmer raids, and let's say the financial exuberance of the Roaring '20s. And by the beginning of the Depression, the pageant movement had essentially vanished. The brilliant Lear de Bessonet brought this history to me, and we began talking about how to revive it. And what we've now created is, and when I say we, I really mean Lear with me taking credit, is a program that creates community partnerships across the city, everybody from the Fortune Society that deals with rehabilitating formerly incarcerated people, to Domestic Workers United, the Union of Domestic Workers, to the brilliant folks at Dream Yard up in the Bronx. We partner with these community organizations year-round, and then at the end of each summer, we put on a pageant that involves 5 of the great professional actors that we can bring together and 200 community members, many of whom have never been on a stage before, to do a Shakespeare musical. The first time we did this, I knew, I'd scheduled, there were 3 performances. I was going to be at the first one, and then I was at the third one, and I knew it would be really good social justice work for the people involved. I knew they'd feel good. What I didn't know is that first performance of The Tempest was the best piece of art that I had seen that year, and I've never missed a public works performance since. They're the best art. Artistry, the ability to make art, is not the possession of a few people. It's the fundamental condition of being human. Every human being has artistic desires, abilities, and need to express. And the only thing that's different is the amount of hours that we get to devote to it. I am one of the privileged few that gets to devote 16 hours a day to doing it. Most people are lucky if they get to do that much in a year, but there is no binary between who's an artist and who isn't. Artistry is the property of everybody. So what I end up with is people need art. If you're going to actually reach people, you have to go to where they are. And if you're going to really make a difference, you actually give them the stage, and you create art with them, and you give them the chance to become the subjects of their own story, the subjects of history, not the objects of history. I'm going to close with the only thing I'll say that doesn't have anything to do with the theater, which is a number of years ago, I was at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and they had a fantastic exhibition of the muralists, the Mexican muralists, Diego Rivera, David Segueros, Frida Kahlo, of their work in the 1920s. And I was, of course, interested in the subject. I went to see, and my jaw dropped, because you could have told me that what I was seeing was late French Impressionism, and I would have thought it was. Still lives, lots of bowls of apples, things that just looked nothing like the muralist movement that I had come to know and love. And then in just reading a little more, what I discovered is that there came a point for those artists that they realized that the art they were making was not consonant with the politics they believed in. It was not reaching the people they cared about, and it was not doing the work that they thought their art should do. So it wasn't that any of them woke up that morning with an ineffable need to paint on buildings. They actually sat down and went, what do we need to do? We need to paint outdoors where nobody needs to pay for it. We need to paint large so that people can see it. And we need to paint subject matter that people can understand and relate to and will impact their lives. They thought up the muralist movement. And that's, in a way, the challenge, I'd say, is really for all of us artists right now. Recognizing that we are privileged to be able to practice this, that we have to figure out how to share that privilege as widely as possible, not only to speak to as many people as possible, to empower as many people as possible to speak. And we have to examine our own practice, not through the lens of simply our own subjectivity or simply what we feel like doing, but through the lens of what use are we? What role are we playing? And that isn't something that will inhibit or censor our work. That is something that can inspire, liberate, and expand our work. So that's all I had to say today, and I thank you very much for listening to me. And I am very happy to be followed by Laura Flanders.